All right. Good evening, everyone. I am back at it tonight with a brand new video. I've released a preview for this video on my TikTok channel, on my Instagram, and on my Facebook, as well as created a YouTube short for this as a means of introducing the topic that I'm going to be talking about tonight. If you've seen the short or if you've seen the preview on any of my other social media platforms, you will find that this message is entitled War Games. Two words, but very profound: war games. And as I was preparing this teaching, I began to think about what this actually means in our lives as Christians, in our lives as believers. And it boils down to our needing to stop being caught off guard. There are countless Christians who are spending a considerable amount of time in their lives being caught off guard by the enemy, caught off guard by his tactics, caught off guard by the weapons that he assaults and assails them with, caught off guard by his schemes and his devices. And as a result, there are countless casualties and countless victims in the church today because of men and women who weren't armed, men and women who weren't prepared and weren't aware of the schemes that the enemy has. And there have been countless unnecessary wounds and scars that have been produced simply because men and women have not been in a place where they can properly discern and recognize the attacks of the enemy that are in their lives. And I want to tell you today that you don't have to be caught off guard anymore. You don't have to be caught off guard by the schemes or the attacks of the enemy. You don't have to be an unnecessary victim. You don't have to be another casualty or another statistic in the long line of casualties and statistics that have been performed and have been in the Christian history ever since really the beginning of time. There have been a lot of men and women who have been caught off guard by the attacks of the enemy. But the question that I want to ask you is, what if you didn't have to be caught off guard? What if you no longer had to wonder about the schemes of the enemy? What if you no longer had to wonder about where the enemy was going to hit you next? What if there was a way that you could know exactly where the enemy was going to be waiting for you, where he was going to be laying snares and traps? I am absolutely convinced that it is very possible for us as believers to be aware of these places where the enemy lies in wait, these places where the enemy lays his traps and snares for us. And I want to show you an example from the Old Testament, specifically the account of Elisha. I want to show you an event or an account that happened in the life of Elisha where he reveals to us the power of the prophetic in our lives. And before I go any further, when I speak of the prophetic, I don't merely speak of foretelling the future. I don't merely speak of foretelling the events that are going to take place. I'm not speaking about what we have come to understand the prophetic to be. There is an element of the prophetic that has absolutely nothing to do with foretelling the events that are going to take place in history or in the coming days. There is an element to the prophetic where it actually is in direct connection to spiritual warfare. There is an element of the prophetic that exposes and reveals the schemes and the tactics of the enemy. There is an element of the prophetic that reveals the snares and the traps that he has for us. And before this teaching is over, I hope to show you exactly how this operates in our lives. By way of introduction and by a sort of a introductory verse, I want to direct your attention to the second epistle which the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian saints. The second epistle, so 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. I want to use this as way of introduction to this element of the prophetic in our lives. Beginning with verse 10. Now whom you forgive anything, I also forgive. For if indeed I have forgiven anything, I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ, lest Satan should take advantage of us. Pay attention to these final words. For we are not ignorant of his devices. I'm going to repeat those last few words. Lest Satan should take advantage of us. And this is clearly his desire in our lives. His desire is to take advantage of us, and the way that he takes advantage of us is through devices. Lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. Very important that we recognize this in the writing of Paul, because Paul makes it abundantly clear that we can be aware of the devices of the enemy. The Apostle Paul makes it abundantly clear that we can know and we can become intimately aware of exactly how the enemy is going to come against us. What does the prophet Isaiah say? No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And it can be possible for us to know the weapons that the enemy will bring against us. It can be possible. What did Jesus say to Simon Peter after that famous declaration that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God? He said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. What if it's possible for us to be aware of anything and everything the gates of hell seek to throw at us? What if it's possible to be aware of the devices that the enemy seeks to bring against us? I want to draw your attention to an Old Testament passage of scripture found in the book of 2 Kings. Here in the book of 2 Kings, we continue to see the story of Elisha. However, it's in this particular passage where we find Elisha moving and operating in a realm of the prophetic that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. Most people are incredibly misguided when it comes to the prophetic, and they fail to recognize this aspect and this element to the prophetic. As we read this passage and as we go through it, we're going to notice a distinction between the earthly and natural senses and the spiritual senses. We will notice a clear and present line being drawn in the sand between the earthly senses that are very possible for us to operate in, and in most cases we do operate in them, but there is another avenue, there is another area in the life of a Christian, and that has to do with their spiritual senses. That has to do with them being able to hear in the Spirit, them being able to see in the Spirit, and as a direct result of that, they are able to properly discern, identify, and understand what is taking place behind the curtain, behind the veil. What we see in the natural is directly affected by what is not seen in the supernatural. I found myself recently praying that God would remove the veil, and that I would not only no longer view things in my life through the natural lens, but that he would allow me to see into the spirit realm and to see exactly what is in operation in my own life, in the life of my family, in the life of those who are around me. Because it is a very dangerous place when we as Christians view the events that are taking place around us solely through the natural lens, solely through the physical lens. In these last days that are increasingly dark and dangerous and divisive, we need to view what is taking place around us not only through the eyes of Jesus, but through the spiritual lens. We must recognize that there is a need for this prophetic discernment in our lives, and I hope to demonstrate this and how incredibly important it is. If you have your Bibles and you're continuing to read, we're going to go to the book of 2 Kings and the 6th chapter. 2 Kings the 6th chapter, and we're going to begin with verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8. Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel. This is important because this was not the first time the king of Syria had made war against Israel. This was not the first time that the king of Syria sought to overtake the people of God. The king of Syria, who was known as Ben-Hadad, that was his name. This was the additional time when he would come against the people of God. Ben-Hadad would make it a great practice in his reign as a king to come against the people of God. And you will find in a previous chapter that Ben-Hadad came against Samaria, besieged it, and he began making claims and demands against Ahab. He began to make claims against the people of God. And I released a video about that recently, and I want us to understand here that this enemy that we see here is not a new enemy. This is an old foe who they had encountered before. At this particular time, however, in this chapter, we find that it was not Ahab who was encountering this former foe, but it was actually his son. It was the next generation that was not encountering a new enemy, but it was a new generation that was encountering an old enemy. And this is one of the things that we must understand, because regardless of what generation we're in, the enemy and adversary that we face is not a new enemy. Solomon wrote, "There is nothing new under the sun." And we must recognize this, because the same foe and the same adversary that we are facing today was the same foe that was in the garden, was the same foe that was faced in the life of David, was the same foe that was faced in the life of the Apostle Peter, and in the life of the Apostle Paul, and in the lives of Martin Luther and George Whitefield and Charles Wesley and John Wesley and Evan Roberts. It is the same foe, just manifesting in a different generation. And what we must understand is that he exists for one reason and one reason alone: to make war against the people of God. We see the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, "My camp will be in such a place." This is important because he's announcing to his servants where he is going to set up his camp. He's not revealing necessarily his tactics or his strategies, although I'm sure that was part of it. But for the sake of this passage, we find that the king of Syria revealed to his servants where he was going to set up his camp. This is important because in verse 9 it says, "And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there." Then the king of Israel sent someone to the place of which the man of God had told him. Thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice. I want us to understand this because this is the foundation of what I'm speaking of as far as war games and us being able to operate in the prophetic. The man of God operated in an element and in a realm of the prophetic where he wasn't necessarily speaking to events that were going to take place, but he was actually discerning and understanding where the camp of the enemy was going to be, where the enemy was going to seek to strike against the people of God. And it was this knowledge, it was this awareness that caused him to warn the king of Israel. We notice that he says, the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, "Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there." And we find the king of Israel sending someone to the place of which the man of God told him. Thus he warned him. So we find him selling beware to the king of Israel, and we find him warning. And this is something that we have to understand within our lives, because there is a great need for this prophetic discernment in our lives to recognize where the enemy has set up his camp, where the enemy has laid his traps, where the enemy has laid his snares. I am absolutely convinced that it is possible for men and women of God to not only not be ignorant of the schemes and the devices of the enemy, but to know how he's going to attack, to know where he's going to attack, and to not be caught off guard. The king of Israel wasn't caught off guard because there was a man of God, there was a prophet of God present in the land during those days who warned him of going into certain places, because if he went to those places, he would surely experience destruction. He would certainly experience demise. And we find the prophet of God warning him. And this is something that we need in our lives, because we need to recognize where the enemy has set his traps, where the enemy has set his snares, where the enemy can and will seek to come against us. It is possible for us to understand this, but it is something that happens only in the supernatural. It is something that only happens in the spiritual realm, when the eyes of our understanding are open, and when we are wise and discerning, and where the Spirit of God reveals, don't go to this place, because if you go to this place, there's danger, there's destruction, there's devastation. Don't go here, because there's going to be the snares and the traps of the enemy over here. Don't get involved with that person, because it's going to bring destruction in your life. Don't go into that particular location, because it's going to bring destruction and devastation in your life. And I believe it's possible for the Spirit of God to warn us. It's possible for the Spirit of God to speak to us in such a way, and to lead and to guide us. What does Scripture say? The steps of a righteous man are ordered of the Lord. What does it say? Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Your word illuminates the path that is in front of me, and it is your word that shines light, that reveals what is before me, that reveals those snares and those traps that are set for me in the darkness. And this is what we see in the life of Elisha. We find Elisha warning the king, and notice it says not just once or twice, which means this was a repeated event. This was a repeated occurrence in this exchange between the king of Syria and the king of Israel, because Elisha was a man who repeatedly warned the king of Israel of where the camp of the enemy was, because if the king of Israel was careless, he would find himself suffering great casualties. Now, what we have to understand about this as well is the warning from Elisha required obedience from the king of Israel. The warning had connected to it obedience. It had connected to it responsibility. There was a responsibility to the prophetic discernment that was present in the life of Elisha. And this is what's required of us. If the Spirit of God reveals to us where the snares and the traps and the weapons and the tactics of the enemy are, we have a responsibility and an obligation to walk in obedience and to avoid those places within our lives. If you keep reading this, you will find that the warning of Elisha troubled and distressed the king of Syria. Verse 11, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing. And he called his servants and said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none, my lord, but Elisha, the prophet who was in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. This is incredibly powerful, because the king of Syria recognized that he couldn't pull one over on the king of Israel. The king of Syria recognized that he wasn't able to one up the king of Israel. He recognized that no matter where he put his camp, the king of Israel would not fall prey to where he had established his camp. He began to recognize, and he initially thought that there was someone in his own camp that was secretly providing intel to the king of Israel. And what I love about this passage is the only intel that was being released at this time was straight from heaven. The only intel came straight from the Spirit, came straight from inspiration. And this is very much needed in our lives today, where we receive this divine counsel, this divine intel that shows us, that reveals to us the devices and the tactics and the snares and the traps of the enemy. What did Paul say? We are not ignorant to his devices. Ignorance implies understanding. Ignorance implies knowledge. It implies that we are not ignorant, but we have a knowledge, we have an understanding, we have an awareness, and we have a discernment. And because of that, we are no longer surprised by the advances of the enemy. We are no longer taken back and caught off guard when this actually happens in our lives. And there are countless Christians who are caught off guard by the attacks and the snares of the enemy because they don't possess this prophetic discernment. They don't possess this prophetic insight that comes only from the Spirit. And we find this divine intel was given by Elisha directly to the king as means of warning him. And we have to understand that with this knowledge, with this warning, with this foresight and this intel, it is going to irritate the adversary and the foe. The adversary and the foe will begin to realize that he can't come against you the way that he would like to. He can't advance against you because you are aware of how he is going to attack. You are aware of when he's going to attack. You are aware of what he's going to do to attack you. And we see in this passage that the king of Syria actually sought to overtake Elisha because he knew if he could get rid of Elisha, he could get rid of the prophetic insight, he could get rid of the prophetic intel, and he would be able to advance his agenda. And this is something that the adversary and the foe desires to do in this generation. He's been trying to do it for generations. If he can get rid of the prophetic voices in a generation, he can get rid of those voices that are a beacon and shining lights and burning torches that provide insight and intel for generations concerning the tactics and the strategies and the snares of the enemy. Now, with that being said, I also want you to recognize that you can move and operate in that same realm. You do not need anyone else to tell you where the snares and the traps of the enemy are. There may be those who will be able to guide you because of experience. There may be times when they do move in the prophetic and the Spirit of the Lord reveals something to them, and they're required to give that word of knowledge and that word of wisdom to you. But I want you to understand that you can operate in this realm. You can operate in the realm where you are not only aware of the devices of the enemy, but you are not taken back by it. You are not caught off guard. The enemy and the adversary can't come against you like he once was able to. He can't attack and assault you like he once was able to do, because you are aware of how he's going to do it. You are aware of what he's going to do. And the longer you walk with the Lord, the more you surrender and submit yourself to him, the more you will receive this divine intel directly from the Spirit as he downloads to you exactly how the enemy and the adversary is going to work in your life. And we must also understand that the enemy and the adversary has taken years to perfect this trade. He has been moving and operating in your life from the day that you were brought into the earth. And one of the greatest truths about this is that there has to come a point in our life when the enemy can't come against us the way that he used to. When the weapons he used to be able to use in our lives that actually prospered are no longer able to prosper. We reach a new realm and a new area in our walk with the Lord, that we are no longer succumb. We are no longer overtaken and overwhelmed by the attacks of the enemy that he used to be able to do, but we are now able to move in this prophetic discernment where we are aware of his devices and we are aware of his schemes. If you keep reading, you will find the response of the king of Syria. So he said, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and get him." And it was told him, saying, "Surely he is in Dothan." Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. Please don't miss this, because the king of Syria was determined to do one thing and one thing alone, and that was to remove Elisha from the equation. Remove the prophetic voice from the equation. Remove that divine insight and intel that could come only from heaven. And so he sent horses and chariots and a great army against Elisha, and he surrounded the city in which Elisha was. And this is important for us to recognize, because this is what the enemy will do. When the enemy realizes that he cannot attack and assault us the way that he used to, he will ramp up his forces. He will ramp up and he will go after that prophetic insight in your life. He will go after that prophetic intel. He will go after that ability to hear from the Spirit and to receive from the Spirit his instruction and his wisdom and his discernment. And the king of Syria knew that if he could remove Elisha from the equation, then he would be able to continue to assault and attack the king of Israel. And so we find him sending horses and chariots and a great army. The enemy will always move and operate in intimidation and with great force. He will always attempt to move against you and I with great displays of strength in order to produce fear and anxiety and terror and dread within us. And we're going to see this playing out in the servant of Elisha. We find, if we keep reading, verse 15, "And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, 'Alas, my master, what shall we do?' So he," Elisha, "answered, 'Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.'" Sounds like the verse in the New Testament when it says, "Greater is he who is in us than he that is in the world." Elisha instructed his servant, who at this point was only able to see in the natural. He was only able to see the flesh and blood army that surrounded them. He was only able to see the horses and chariots. And he cried out to Elisha, similar to when the disciples were in the midst of the storm and they cried out to Jesus, "Lord, do you not care that we perish?" And then we find Jesus rebuking them, standing up in the midst of the storm and bringing everything to a calm, everything to a still. Here we find Elisha instructing his servant to not be afraid, because more were those who were with them, more were those who were for them than those who are against him. And we have to understand this, because in this verse there is this distinction between the physical sight and spiritual sight. We find, "And Elisha prayed and said, 'Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see.'" What does Jesus say to one of the churches in the prophetic book of the Revelation? "Anoint your eyes with eye salve that you may see." And there is a lot of spiritual blindness in the church. People who are unable to see in the spirit realm. People who are unable to see in the spirit. People who only move and operate in the physical and natural and don't recognize that there is a realm in the supernatural and the spiritual that we can actually move and operate in. And Elisha prayed that his eyes would be open. This is important because his physical eyes were already open. His physical eyes were already aware of what was going on. It was his physical and natural sight that triggered the emotions and the response within his heart of fear and anxiety and terror and dread. But what Elisha prayed was that his eyes would be open, that the eyes of his understanding, that his spiritual senses would be open. And this is something that is needed in our lives. And it's what I pray for you, and it's what I pray for me, that the eyes of our understanding would be open, that we might see. Notice he says, open his eyes that he may see. Elisha didn't have to tell the Lord what his servant needed to see. All he said to the Lord was, open his eyes that he may see. Elisha was aware of it. Elisha saw what was behind the scenes, but Elisha wanted his servant to, because he recognized that his servant needed to understand and be aware of who was fighting with them, who was fighting for them, who was fighting their battles for them against their enemies. We find the Lord responding. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. I love that. The Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. That's my prayer for you. That's my prayer for me, that God would open our eyes that we might see. God, open the eyes of everyone who's watching this video, that they might see, that their eyes would be open, and not even in the physical or natural sense. God, it's so easy to see in the natural and physical sense, but there is a great need for us to see in the spiritual realm. And I pray for you, and I pray for me, that our eyes would be opened by the Lord, that we may see. Notice what he sees. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. When all he saw before were horses and chariots in the natural, now he was seeing the same thing. Notice, he was seeing the same thing. He was still seeing horses and chariots, but now he was seeing with his spiritual eyes. Now he was moving and operating in a realm of the prophetic, and now he was operating with his spiritual eyes being open, and he was able to see a different form of horse and chariot. Now he was seeing horses and chariots of fire, and he was able to recognize who it was that was fighting with them, who it was that was fighting for them. And when we are dealing with this prophetic insight, when we are dealing with this, we have to recognize that there is a difference between what we see in the natural and what we see in the spirit, what we see in the natural and what we see in the supernatural. And we need to start moving and operating in the realm where we are no longer governed by what we see with our natural eyes, but we are governed by what we see with our spiritual eyes. We are no longer governed by what we hear with our natural ears, but we are governed by what we hear with our spiritual ears. Elisha prayed that his servant would see. His servant saw, and he would see that the horses and chariots of fire surrounded them, which would be a confirmation of the words that Elisha said. Elisha said, "Do not fear, because greater are those who are for us than those who are against us." And Elisha simply prayed and asked the Lord that he would see. The Lord honored his request. The Lord caused the servant of Elisha to see, and he began to recognize that there were horses and chariots of fire all around them, which is a symbol. It's a picture of divine protection. It's a picture of the protection of the Lord and what the Lord is willing to do to protect his servant. What the Lord is willing to do to protect his people. And this is, if only you could see what the Lord has done to protect you. If only you and I could see what the Lord has in place around us right now to protect us. Imagine if you were made aware of all of those things that could have happened to you were it not for the protection of God. I shudder to think of all the things that could have happened to me if it wasn't for the divine protection of God. And I'm not even talking about things that I'm aware of. I'm talking about things that couldn't even materialize in my life because of the divine protection of the Lord. things that couldn't even materialize or actualize in your life because of the horses and chariots of fire that are around you, that were around you throughout the course of your life. And this is something that is tremendously important for us because we must understand the divine protection of God and the lengths that God will do to protect us. If you keep reading, it says, so when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. Now Elisha said to them, this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. So it was when they had come to Samaria that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw. And there they were inside Samaria. This is absolutely incredible because in the previous passage, we find Elisha praying that the eyes of his servants would be open, that he would see. Now he is still praying for physical and natural sight, but he is praying that the enemy is struck with blindness. He asked the Lord to strike the enemy with blindness, and the Lord answered his request. Would you think it was crazy if you knew you could pray and ask the Lord to create confusion in the camp of the enemy, to create chaos in the camp of the enemy, to cause the enemy to be blinded and not be able to see the way that he would want? I love the accounts of Elisha because when you read the accounts of the enemy coming against the people of God, you will realize the Lord sending confusion and chaos into the midst of the enemy's camp to scatter and disperse the enemy. We see it even in this particular section of the book of 2 Kings when the people of Syria came against the people of Israel, and the Lord caused supernaturally and miraculous a sound of horses and chariots to be heard. So great and so thunderous was the sound that they abandoned their camp. They fled, left everything intact completely, and the people of Israel were not only able to plunder the camp of the enemy, but they were actually able to come out on the other side of a famine because of it. The Lord not only brought them deliverance from their enemy, but the Lord ended a famine in their life because he caused chaos and confusion to take place in the camp of the enemy. And if you want to truly see some incredible accounts of spiritual warfare in all of Scripture, I recommend reading the book of 2 Kings and the narrative of Elisha, because you'll see the great lengths that God was willing to do to protect and deliver his people. You'll see the great lengths that God was willing to take in order to deliver his people from their enemies and from their foes and from their adversaries. Elisha prayed that the enemy would be struck with blindness. And we see this even in the life of David. David was a man who recognized that he could pray that God would smite his enemies, that God would arise and his enemies be scattered. As the song says, let God arise and his enemies be scattered. You and I can pray, and we must begin to start praying that God would thrust the enemy's camp into confusion, that God would create chaos, that God would bring blindness into the camp of the enemy, that God would strike the enemy with such force and such power and such might that they are unable to mount any attack against us. Elisha prayed for the physical eyes of those who had come against him to be blinded, and God answered. And we not only see that God answered, we find that Elisha would lead them from Dothan, where he was, and lead them to Samaria. So now we not only find the army that came against him being struck with blindness, but now we find Elisha leading the enemy army away from where he was. How absolutely incredible is that? That Elisha, the one whom the enemy army had come against, was now leading the enemy army that was blind. It is absolutely fascinating when you read this passage and when you think about it. And this is a realm that you and I can walk in as Christians. This is a realm that you and I can walk in our lives. And this is that element of prophetic discernment that we can actually understand and be aware of the schemes of the enemy. And we can begin to pray against the enemy. We can pray that God would thrust confusion, chaos, blindness, turmoil in the camp of the enemy, that the enemy is no longer able to rise up against us. Elisha prayed that they would be struck with blindness, and they were struck with blindness. And then Elisha led the camp of the enemy away from Dothan, led them away from perhaps the innocent people that were there. And now Elisha became the captain of the army of the enemy. Absolutely mind-blowing when you think about it. Absolutely incredible when you consider the spiritual implications and the application that can take place within our lives when we can ourselves pray that God would thrust the camp of the enemy into confusion, and he actually responds by doing it. This passage concludes with the king of Israel seeing this great army in the midst of the city of Samaria. Now, when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "My father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them?" But he answered, "You shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and bow? Set food and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." Then he prepared a great feast for them, and after they ate and drank, he sent them away, and they went to their master. So the bands of the Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. There is one particular passage that comes to my mind when I read this, and it is the words of David in the 23rd Psalm. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Here we find a table being set before the king of Israel in the presence of his enemies, and he is actually feeding food, and he is actually providing food and drink to the enemy, a table, a great feast there in Samaria before sending the enemy on their way. And this is a great truth in the lives of Christians, that God can actually prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. This table wasn't prepared for the king of Israel. This table wasn't necessarily prepared for the people of Israel. This table was prepared for the enemy and adversary rather than the king killing them. And I love how this passage ends, because it ends saying the Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. This is exactly how this passage should end, because what began with the enemy seeking to come against the people of God would ultimately culminate in the point where the enemy would no longer come against them. The enemy would no longer send raids, because the enemy not only recognized that there was a man of God in the land, but the enemy also recognized that the man of God operated in great authority before the living God, that he would actually pray and that they would experience blindness and that their sight would be restored. Imagine the stories that were told in Syria when this army returned. Imagine the discussions that were had between these soldiers as they were riding their horses and in their chariots back to Syria. And imagine what they would tell their master. "We went against the man of God. We went to see, they seized him. We went to capture him, and yet all of a sudden we were struck with blindness. We couldn't see where we were. We were led to a certain place. Our eyes were open. Suddenly we were able to see, and we were in the city of Samaria." Not only that, but the king chose not to kill us. The king chose instead to feed us and to give us drink. Absolutely incredible when you read this passage, because we find that the people of God in the midst of Samaria were actually delivered not only because of the man of God, but they were delivered because God was going through great lengths to protect them. God was going through great lengths to protect his servant Elisha, and he was going through great lengths to protect his people. I want to conclude this just by giving you some passages of scripture that help us to understand how we can be aware of the schemes of the enemy, how we can move and operate in this prophetic discernment, how we can operate in this realm. We are not ignorant of the devices of the enemy. Genesis 4, 6, and 7, God is speaking to Cain. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." This is important because at the very root of this encounter between the Lord and Cain, at the very root and center of his heart was anger. And God recognized anger, and he warned him. He warned him specifically about this in his life and told him that sin was crouching at the door, but he needed to rule over it. And you and I have to recognize this because the same is applicable to us. Sin is crouching at our door, and we must rule over it. We must master it, lest it consume and overtake us. Ephesians 4, verses 25 through 28. "Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need." Here in this passage, we find lying, we find anger, and we find stealing. And these are additional areas in our lives where we must recognize where the enemy will attack us and where the enemy will assault us. And if we are aware of these triggers, if we are aware of these snares, if we are aware of these traps, and we're able to identify them, then we can find ourselves moving and operating in a realm where we are not overtaken by the enemy or the adversary. The very first passage I read at the beginning of this, Paul was speaking about forgiveness, and it was in the context of forgiveness that he was actually speaking about not being ignorant to the devices of the enemy. Unforgiveness is one of the greatest snares of the enemy. Unforgiveness is one of the greatest tactics and tools and weapons of the enemy. And the Apostle Paul wanted the people of God to understand this because he was giving them a signpost. He was giving them a warning of what they needed to guard themselves against because of how deadly and dangerous unforgiveness is. If it was dangerous for them, then it is still dangerous for you and I. And if any of us are walking in unforgiveness or bitterness or offense or a grudge, we need to release the person who may have wronged or offended us. We need to forgive them. We need to ask for forgiveness for our own unforgiveness, and then we must allow God to set us free and deliver us that we might operate in holiness in his sight. Luke chapter 22, Jesus is speaking to Simon, and the Lord said, "Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat." That literally means a violent shaking. Satan has asked to have you that he may shake you violently. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. This prophetic discernment recognizes the violent shaking that the enemy seeks to bring against our lives. It recognizes that there is a great shaking that the enemy desires to bring against us, and the enemy desires to sift us as wheat. The enemy desires to shake us. And what I love when it comes to threshing wheat is you would literally take the wheat and throw it in the air, and all of the impurities, all the chaff would be blown away by the wind, and that which was the harvest, that which was the true wheat, would fall to the ground. And this is what is the language that is used here, that Satan has asked to sift him, to violently shake him, so that way Satan wanted to do it to destroy Peter, but Jesus prayed that his faith would fail not, because all things work together for the good of those who love him and are the called according to his purpose. What the enemy meant for evil, Jesus would turn around and make it good, and he would pray for the faith of Simon that it would not fail. He would pray that Simon's faith would be strengthened, because we must recognize the importance of faith when it comes to our spiritual walk, the importance of faith when it comes to our spiritual journey. We must all move and operate in this realm of faith. And you'll actually see this in the first epistle which Peter wrote. So Jesus told Peter, I prayed for you that your faith would not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. We find this connection between sifting and faith. And in the 5th chapter of the 1 Peter, beginning with verse 5, yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. Notice in this passage the need for humility, the need to submit to God, and the need to cast all of your cares. One of the greatest opportunities for the devil in the life of a believer is when those individuals aren't casting their cares upon the Lord, when they are moving in anxiety, when they are moving with worry, when they are moving in doubt, when they are moving with fear and terror and dread, where they are moving in this realm of unbelief. This is where the enemy will traffic his goods, and this is where he will lay his snares. The enemy will lay his snares in doubt. He will lay his snares in unbelief. He will lay his snares there, but we are not ignorant of his devices. We are not ignorant of his schemes. We recognize how he's going to come against us. We recognize what is needed in our lives, and that is to humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord and to submit ourselves to God and to resist the devil. And when we match our humility and submission to God with our resistance of the devil, he will flee. James also speaks about this. He also speaks about resisting the devil. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Here again, we find this need for submission. And we find not only when the devil flees from us, we find that in the process of that, we are drawing nearer to God, and God is drawing nearer to us. And this should be the normal, everyday experience of every believer, where the devil flees from them and where God draws nearer to them. The devil flees, God draws near. The devil flees, and God draws near. And this is what we need in our lives. We need this resistance to the enemy, knowing that when we resist the enemy, he will flee from us, and that we are free to draw near to God, and God will draw near to us. I'm going to read one more passage of scripture, and then I'm going to close this out. Paul writing to the Ephesians in the 6th chapter, beginning with verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. and having done all to stand. Stand therefore, having girded your waist with the truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Notice in this passage that we find that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil and the fiery darts of the wicked one. Fiery darts and wiles. We are not ignorant to this. God has given us not only prophetic insight and discernment, but God has given us armor. God has given us weapons to be able to combat the enemy in the midst of whatever we face. We must be those who are clothed with the full armor of God. We must be those who take up the sword of the Spirit and who take up the shield of faith, that we might extinguish the fiery darts of the enemy. It is possible for you and I to move and operate in a realm of prophetic discernment where we are aware of the schemes of the enemy. We are aware of those places where he will set traps and lay snares for us. We are engaged in war games, and we don't have to be caught off guard. We don't have to be victims. We don't have to be casualties of war anymore. We don't have to experience these wounds and afflictions of the enemy. We can move and operate in a realm where we are able to be one step ahead of the enemy. The enemy comes in one way, but he will flee 7 ways. And it is my prayer that you and I have the eyes of our understanding open and the ears of our understanding open, and that we would have this prophetic discernment that is so desperately needed in our generation today. I hope you've been blessed by this video. Please like the video. Please go ahead and share it with your friends, family, and coworkers. Leave a comment for me. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know how this has impacted you, and please subscribe to my channel, and then I hope that this message will resonate with you, and I hope that it will bring encouragement in the days ahead. Thank you so much, and God bless.